On October 18, 1942, at almost precisely the darkest moment of the entire Guadalcanal campaign, a new admiral arrived to take command of American forces in the South Pacific, and within hours, word of his arrival had spread through the ranks of exhausted, malnourished Marines and sailors who had spent 2 months wondering whether anyone above them still believed the campaign could actually be won. Vice Admiral William Halsey had not yet made a single tactical decision. He had not repositioned a single ship or issued a single new order. And yet, according to multiple first-hand accounts from men present at the time, news of his arrival alone produced an immediate, audible surge of morale across the entire theater. Men who had been grinding through starvation rations and nightly Japanese naval bombardment, suddenly cheering simply because a different man was now in charge. This is the story of what Halsey actually did in the days and weeks that followed, and how the specific decisions he made during the campaign's most desperate stretch helped turn a battle that many senior American commanders privately feared was being lost into the campaign that started Japan's long retreat. Here is the question worth carrying through this story. What does a new commander actually do, in practical terms, when he takes charge of a battle that everyone around him believes might already be slipping away? Halsey's reputation preceding his arrival in the South Pacific had been built over a career that already spanned decades of naval service, including a period commanding the carrier task force that had launched the Doolittle raid against Tokyo earlier in the war, an operation that, whatever its ultimate strategic significance, had already established Halsey in the public and naval imagination as an officer willing to accept genuine operational risk in pursuit of an aggressive strategic objective. Exactly the kind of reputation that made him the obvious choice once Nimitz concluded the South Pacific Theater needed a fundamentally different command temperament than Gormley had been providing. The specific psychological toll 2 months of grinding, under-resourced combat had taken on the American command structure at Guadalcanal was not unique to Gormley individually, but reflected a broader pattern several military historians studying command endurance under sustained crisis conditions have identified across different conflicts and different eras. A recognition that even highly capable and experienced officers can experience a gradual erosion of decisive capacity when subjected to extended periods of high-stakes responsibility without meaningful relief. A human limitation that effective military institutions have historically needed mechanisms to recognize and address before it compromises operational outcomes. Exactly the kind of mechanism Nimitz's decision to relieve Gormley ultimately represented. By October of 1942, the Guadalcanal campaign had reached a genuinely precarious point, roughly 2 months into a fight that had already cost the American position at sea dearly and left the Marines holding Henderson Field, surviving on severely reduced rations under near-constant nighttime naval bombardment from Japanese ships running supply and reinforcement missions through the surrounding waters. Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, commanding American forces in the South Pacific Theater since the campaign's opening weeks, had, according to multiple accounts from officers who observed him during this period, grown visibly exhausted and increasingly pessimistic about the campaign's prospects, a psychological and physical toll that several senior officers reporting up the chain of command described with genuine concern about whether Gormley retained the decisiveness the deteriorating situation demanded. The specific process by which Nimitz reached his decision to relieve Gormley reflected the gravity with which he treated the choice, involving direct consultation with officers who had recently observed conditions in the South Pacific Theater firsthand, and a careful weighing of the risk that a command change amid an ongoing crisis might itself introduce disruption at exactly the wrong moment, against the risk that leaving Gormley in place might allow the campaign's deteriorating trajectory to continue unchecked. Nimitz ultimately concluded that the risk of continued hesitant leadership outweighed the risk of disruption from a command transition, a judgment that historians studying his wartime decision-making have generally credited as one of his more difficult and, in retrospect, clearly correct personnel decisions of the entire war. Admiral Chester Nimitz, monitoring the campaign's trajectory from Pearl Harbor with growing unease, made the decision to relieve Gormley of command, a step that reflected just how seriously Nimitz regarded the risk that hesitant or overly cautious leadership at exactly this moment might allow a campaign that remained, in October of 1942, still genuinely winnable, to slip into outright defeat. The decision to replace Gormley with Halsey specifically was deliberate and pointed, since Halsey's reputation throughout the Navy, built over years of pre-war and early wartime service, centered specifically on an aggressive, decisive command temperament that stood in direct and intentional contrast to the exhausted caution Gormley had come to represent. Gormley's own removal was handled with a specific bluntness that itself reflected the urgency Nimitz attached to the situation, communicated through a terse operational message rather than any extended face-to-face transition process, a manner of relief that, while professionally difficult for Gormley personally, minimized the delay between the decision and Halsey's actual assumption of command at a moment when Nimitz judged every additional day of uncertain leadership carried real strategic risk. Gormley himself, in later years, reportedly expressed a measure of understanding for the decision even as it represented a painful professional setback, acknowledging the accumulated strain the campaign had placed on him even if he had not, at the time, fully recognized how visibly that strain was affecting his own command decisions. Halsey's arrival came at a moment when Japanese forces were actively preparing one of their most significant reinforcement and counterattack efforts of the entire campaign, a buildup that, had it succeeded, could plausibly have overwhelmed the Marine defenses around Henderson Field and reversed months of hard-won American gains. The specific tactical and strategic decisions facing the new commander were not abstract or theoretical. They involved immediate, consequential choices about how aggressively to commit scarce naval assets, including the American carrier forces still recovering from earlier losses in the campaign, against a Japanese naval force that retained real and, in several specific engagements, demonstrated superiority in nighttime surface combat throughout the waters surrounding Guadalcanal. One of Halsey's earliest and most consequential decisions after assuming command involved a direct, personal visit to Guadalcanal itself, traveling forward to assess conditions firsthand, rather than relying exclusively on staff reports and communications relayed back through the normal chain of command, a choice that put him in direct contact with the Marines and sailors actually enduring the campaign's hardships, and that, according to several accounts from officers present during the visit, reinforced both his own understanding of the tactical situation and the morale-boosting effect of his presence among troops who had grown accustomed to a more distant, headquarters-based command style under his predecessor. What Halsey actually did upon assuming command reflected the same decisive temperament that had produced the immediate morale boost his mere arrival had triggered. Rather than conducting an extended review period or gradually easing into the theater's command structure, Halsey moved quickly to assess the immediate tactical situation and began making consequential decisions about naval asset commitment within days of taking charge, a pace that several officers serving under him at the time contrasted directly with what they described as Gormley's increasingly paralyzed decision-making in the weeks immediately preceding the change of command. Halsey also moved quickly to address the campaign's chronic supply and logistics problems, pressing his own staff and the broader Pacific Fleet supply apparatus to prioritize Guadalcanal's resupply needs, with an urgency that several quartermaster officers serving in the theater at the time described as a marked and immediately noticeable change from the somewhat more routine, less aggressively prioritized logistics support the campaign had received under the previous command structure, a shift that, while less dramatic than his subsequent battleship commitment decision, directly addressed the starvation-level rationing that had been afflicting Marine units on the island for weeks before his arrival. Stop and consider what this actually meant in practice, because the abstract description of decisive leadership understates just how consequential and risky the specific choices facing Halsey actually were. By mid-November of 1942, Japanese naval forces were preparing to commit battleships specifically to bombard Henderson Field into uselessness, ahead of a major troop reinforcement convoy, an operation that, if successful, threatened to destroy American air power on the island entirely, and open the door to a Japanese ground offensive against a Marine garrison that would have had no effective air cover to call upon. Halsey faced a genuinely difficult calculation: commit his own remaining heavy naval assets, including battleships that represented an irreplaceable strategic resource at this stage of the war, against a Japanese force operating in waters where Japanese night-fighting tactics had already inflicted serious American losses earlier in the campaign, or hold those assets back and risk losing Henderson Field to the bombardment and invasion Japanese forces were actively preparing. The decision was not made without careful, if compressed, consultation with his own staff and subordinate commanders, several of whom, according to later accounts, raised legitimate concerns about the risk of committing the fleet's last available battleships to a nighttime engagement in waters where Japanese forces had already demonstrated a real tactical advantage in exactly this type of combat. Halsey listened to these concerns, weighed them against the strategic consequence of losing Henderson Field entirely, and made the final call himself, a decision-making pattern, soliciting input but retaining ultimate personal responsibility for the outcome, that several officers who served under him throughout the war identified as characteristic of his broader command style. Halsey chose to commit. He ordered the battleships Washington and South Dakota, essentially the last heavy surface combatants available to the American Pacific Fleet at this specific moment in the war, into the waters around Guadalcanal to intercept and contest the Japanese battleship force before it could reach Henderson Field. A decision that placed some of the Navy's most valuable remaining capital ships directly into exactly the kind of close-range nighttime surface engagement that had already produced disaster for American forces at Savo Island months earlier. The tactical command of the actual naval engagement, once Halsey had made the strategic decision to commit the battleships, fell to Rear Admiral Willis Lee, an officer with genuine technical expertise in gunnery and, notably, in the emerging tactical application of shipboard radar, a combination of skills that would prove directly relevant to how the subsequent battle actually unfolded. Halsey's decision to delegate the specific tactical execution to Lee, while retaining the broader strategic responsibility for having committed the ships at all, reflected a command pattern that recurred throughout his wartime service, setting the overall strategic direction decisively while trusting subordinate commanders with genuine tactical expertise to execute the specific engagement details. Japanese naval commanders planning the mid-November reinforcement and bombardment operation had, by this stage of the campaign, developed genuine confidence in their nighttime surface combat capabilities, a confidence built on a real and repeated tactical advantage demonstrated across several earlier engagements in the waters surrounding Guadalcanal, where superior Japanese torpedo technology, extensive night-fighting training, and effective visual spotting techniques had consistently outperformed American naval forces in close-range nighttime combat throughout the campaign's first several months. This accumulated advantage shaped Japanese operational planning for the mid-November effort, an assumption that American naval forces, even if committed to contest the operation, would likely be unable to prevent the battleship bombardment from reaching and devastating Henderson Field. Japanese planners were also operating under the accumulated confidence of a string of earlier tactical successes in the waters around Guadalcanal specifically, engagements including the disaster American forces had suffered at Savo Island, and several subsequent nighttime actions in which Japanese naval gunnery and torpedo tactics had repeatedly demonstrated a real qualitative edge over American forces. A pattern of success that made the specific assumption of continued Japanese naval superiority in these waters seem, from the Japanese planning perspective, entirely reasonable rather than reckless overconfidence. A miscalculation rooted in genuine, repeated prior experience rather than baseless assumption. What Japanese commanders had not fully accounted for was the specific combination of American radar technology, which by this stage of the campaign had improved meaningfully since the disaster at Savo Island, and the sheer, uncompromising commitment Halsey's decision represented, a willingness to risk irreplaceable capital ships in exactly the kind of engagement Japanese doctrine had assumed American commanders would remain too cautious to accept. The resulting battle, fought across multiple nights in mid-November, produced intense and costly fighting on both sides, but ultimately succeeded in preventing the Japanese battleship force from completing its planned bombardment of Henderson Field, and in turning back the major reinforcement convoy that had been the operation's underlying strategic purpose. The fighting itself unfolded across two distinct nights of close engagement, the first producing severe American losses, including several cruisers and destroyers sunk or badly damaged in the same chaotic, close-range conditions that had proven so costly earlier in the campaign. And the second, on the night the battleships Washington and South Dakota actually engaged the Japanese battleship force directly, producing a result that validated Halsey's gamble decisively. Washington's gunnery, guided in part by the radar technology Lee had specific expertise in applying tactically, inflicted crippling damage on the Japanese battleship Kirishima in a relatively brief but intense exchange of fire, a result that forced the remaining Japanese naval force to abandon the bombardment mission and withdraw rather than press forward against Henderson Field as originally planned. The Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, decided across these several nights of intense fighting in mid-November, represented the specific and decisive vindication of Halsey's willingness to commit scarce naval assets at exactly the moment caution might have counseled restraint. American losses in the fighting were real and serious, including several destroyers and cruisers sunk in the same close-range, chaotic nighttime engagements that had proven so costly earlier in the campaign, but the strategic outcome, preventing Henderson Field's destruction and blocking the major Japanese reinforcement effort, achieved exactly the result Halsey's decision to commit had been designed to secure. Naval historians studying the battle have consistently identified this engagement as the specific turning point, after which Japan's ability to seriously contest naval control of the waters around Guadalcanal began an irreversible decline, a strategic shift that traces directly back to the specific, risk-accepting decision Halsey made in the earliest weeks of his command. The Japanese reinforcement convoy that the entire battleship bombardment operation had been designed to protect suffered its own severe losses during this same period, with American aircraft flying from Henderson Field itself, the airfield Halsey's decision had specifically preserved, inflicting devastating damage on the transport ships attempting to land fresh troops and supplies. A direct and almost poetic strategic consequence in which the very airfield the Japanese operation had aimed to destroy became the instrument that helped destroy the reinforcement effort the operation had been protecting. Halsey's leadership style during this period extended beyond the specific decision to commit his battleships, reflecting a broader command philosophy that prioritized decisive, if imperfect, action over the kind of extended deliberation that, in the specific circumstances of a rapidly deteriorating tactical situation, could itself become a form of paralysis. Several officers who served under him during this period specifically credited his willingness to make consequential decisions quickly, and to accept responsibility for the outcomes of those decisions rather than deferring risk upward through extended consultation, as the single most significant change in command culture that followed his arrival in the theater. Sailors and Marines who fought through this specific stretch of the campaign, in post-war interviews and memoirs, consistently identified the psychological shift that accompanied Halsey's arrival and his subsequent decisive actions as a genuinely significant factor in their own morale and endurance through the campaign's final and most difficult weeks. A factor that, while impossible to measure with the same precision as ship losses or casualty figures, several military historians studying the campaign have argued deserves serious consideration, alongside the more conventionally quantifiable strategic and tactical factors that decided the battle's outcome. News of the naval victory, once it reached the American public through wartime press coverage, provided a significant morale boost on the home front as well, arriving at a moment in the war when the American public had grown accustomed to a mixture of triumph and setback across different Pacific engagements, and welcomed clear, unambiguous confirmation that the costly, extended Guadalcanal campaign was finally producing a decisive strategic result, rather than continuing indefinitely as an uncertain, grinding stalemate. Halsey's reputation, forged specifically through his conduct during this critical stretch of the Guadalcanal campaign, established him as one of the most publicly recognized and, among the sailors and Marines who served under him, most genuinely respected American commanders of the entire Pacific War. A reputation built on the specific, documented contrast between the exhausted caution his predecessor had come to represent and the decisive risk acceptance he brought to represent. This reputation would carry forward through the remainder of the war, shaping Halsey's subsequent commands and his continued association, in American public memory, with an aggressive, take-the-fight-to-the-enemy command style that became, for many Americans following the war through wartime newspaper coverage, one of the more recognizable individual command personalities of the entire Pacific campaign. Halsey's own famous public statements from this period, including his often-quoted declaration of intent regarding Japanese forces, phrased in blunt and aggressive terms that stood in sharp contrast to the more measured public rhetoric other senior American commanders typically employed, reflected a genuine and deliberate choice to project confidence and aggression publicly as well as in his private command decisions, a communication style that some contemporaries viewed as unbecoming of a senior flag officer and others credited as exactly the kind of morale-building public messaging the campaign's exhausted forces needed to hear from their new commander. It is worth noting, in the interest of a complete and honest historical account, that Halsey's aggressive command style, the same quality that proved so decisive and effective during the specific crisis of mid-November 1942 at Guadalcanal, would later draw serious criticism when applied under different circumstances, most notably during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944, when a similarly aggressive decision to pursue a Japanese decoy carrier force left the invasion beaches at Leyte more exposed than some historians have argued, was strategically prudent. This later controversy does not erase the genuine and well-documented value his decisiveness provided during the Guadalcanal crisis specifically, but it does illustrate how the same command temperament that serves brilliantly in one set of tactical circumstances can produce more contested results when applied without the same careful calculation of risk against a different set of stakes. Rear Admiral Willis Lee, whose tactical execution during the decisive nighttime battleship engagement proved so consequential, went on to further distinguished service, applying radar-guided gunnery techniques throughout the remainder of the Pacific War, a career trajectory that reflected how the specific tactical innovations validated during this engagement. Applying still-maturing radar technology to nighttime naval gunnery, with genuine precision, directly informed American naval doctrine for the numerous subsequent Pacific naval engagements still to come, a technical and tactical legacy that extended well beyond the immediate strategic outcome at Guadalcanal itself. The broader lesson historians studying command transitions during moments of military crisis consistently draw from Halsey's arrival at Guadalcanal centers on the specific and measurable value of decisive leadership at exactly the moment a deteriorating situation most tempts caution. A lesson that extends well beyond the specific tactical details of any single naval engagement into a broader principle about command psychology under sustained pressure. Gormley was not, by most historical accounts, an incompetent officer, but the accumulated psychological weight of 2 months commanding an under-resourced, embattled campaign appears to have gradually eroded exactly the decisive capacity the campaign's most critical moments demanded, a human and understandable failure of endurance rather than of raw competence. Halsey, arriving fresh and unburdened by that accumulated weight, could bring exactly the risk-accepting decisiveness the specific moment required, a contrast that historians studying the campaign have consistently identified as one of the most consequential command decisions Nimitz made across the entire Pacific War. Remember the question this story opened with: what does a new commander actually do, in practical terms, when he takes charge of a battle everyone around him fears might already be slipping away? The honest answer, drawn directly from Halsey's specific documented conduct across those first critical weeks, is that it came down to a handful of concrete, high-stakes choices made under genuine uncertainty: a forward visit to see conditions firsthand, an immediate push to fix a broken supply chain, and, when the moment demanded it, a willingness to risk the fleet's most valuable remaining ships, rather than hold them back out of caution that, in the specific circumstances the campaign faced that November, would very likely have cost the entire position at Guadalcanal instead. If you want to understand what a new commander actually does, in concrete and consequential terms, when he takes charge of a battle everyone around him fears might already be slipping away, and how one specific decision to risk irreplaceable battleships turned the tide of the entire Guadalcanal campaign, this is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.